Welcome back to the 1945 Willys MB restoration. Today we're going to be installing the fuel system. We've got a new fuel tank, fuel lines, fuel pump. These parts have been sitting in the back of the Jeep for years just waiting to be installed. I've got a lot more footage I need to edit. The Jeep is really coming together nicely. We've got a lot of parts available and I've been getting a lot of stuff put on. So be sure to subscribe and follow along as we go through the process of getting this Jeep running again. Now let's dive into the fuel system of a late Willys MB.
Here's one problem with working with new hardware versus the original hardware, is that the original stuff was made in 1/8" increments, and now you're lucky if you can find it in 1/4" increments. So either I will need to cut some of these down, like for instance these fuel pump bolts should be 7/8, but all I could get was 1 inch. So I may need to either grind those down, or there's enough room in the block that it will torque up just fine. So that's one problem with working with new hardware on a 70-year-old project. So I just checked this fastener and it just screws straight into the block. It's not a blind hole, and it actually goes into the camshaft. So the 7/8 measurement on this particular application is going to be extremely important that we get right so that the bolt doesn't torque into the camshaft. So I'll go ahead and shave these bolts down.
So now that I've verified the bolts are going to fit, I need to turn the engine over until the camshaft is at kind of a bottom dead center position for that fuel pump. It's just easier so I'm not fighting the fuel pump spring. And you can see I put some thread sealant on those bolts as they're not blind holes, and oil will seep out of them if they're not sealed. And it was a tight fit to get those bolts in there. Oof. But after kind of messing around with the socket and an extension and a wobbly, I did end up getting the bolt in there. I rebuilt this fuel pump a few years ago, and you could see I zinc plated some of the metal parts, and we got new brass fittings for it. Interesting on the 45 and late MBs and CJs is they didn't have a fuel filter, so that little brass screen is the only fuel filter. And this also doesn't have the primer lever because of its late fuel pump. So I go ahead and torque them to spec, and that is 15 foot-pounds for this application. And then I'm going to turn over the engine a couple times and just make sure I didn't actually contact the camshaft, even though we checked, and everything turned over just fine, and the fuel pump is now pumping. Alright, and now we're going to install the felt strips for the fuel tank. These are the anti-squeak strips, and it's just a peel and stick type product, and they're actually very easy to install. These came from Ron Fitzpatrick Jeep Parts, and they come with a little diagram that I'm referencing so that I know where all the little sticky pads go. Now I'm going to flip it over, and it's time to install the fuel level sender for the fuel gauge. This is one of those parts that I've had sitting on the shelf for years, just waiting to be assembled, and today's the day. Now, these aftermarket fuel tanks can be really finicky. I don't know if it's the way they're punched out or stamped together or what, but this tank gave me all kinds of problems. I'm pretty sure it came from Kaiser Willys, and it's an Omix-Ada replacement tank. And so I did some online research and found out a lot of people have had the same problems. The opening for the fuel level sender wasn't quite right, and I had to kind of cut away some metal to get it to work. The bolt pattern was okay, and I did end up getting it all screwed together. And then at the time I went ahead and put the fuel level wire cover on the sender for now, because I don't want to lose that piece in my pile of parts. So I go ahead and just install that for now so that I know where it's at. It's on the Jeep. And now that I have the wiring harness, I actually do need to go back in, remove that, and install the separate little jumper lead for the fuel level sender that goes from the tank to the instrument panel. So now the tank's all ready. Let's get it installed in the Jeep. Now, before the tank can actually be dropped in, there are some rubber seals that need to be put in place. I used 3M weather strip adhesive to hold them in place. So this one fits on that little tiny flap of metal along the rear of the tank, and it just kind of pushes over on that. And the next one was supposed to be a self-adhesive peel and stick, but the peel and stick wore out and there was no adhesive left. So I ended up having to peel all the adhesive off of this piece and then just use weather stripping adhesive. And this piece actually gave me the most trouble. In the end, I had to remove it from the Jeep because it was causing the tank to not seat right. So that ended up being a giant waste of time. And finally, I just needed to seal the large round rubber donut that goes around the fuel line hole in the bottom of the tank, and that's designed to keep mud and stuff from coming back into the Jeep. The other seals keep dirt and stuff from going underneath the fuel tank. And here we are the next day. I let that adhesive dry and we're test fitting the tank, and it's a really tight fit, so I can tell I'm going to have to do some work with these seals and the felts and stuff. Let's get the fuel tank straps ready. Here's the fuel tank straps, and as you can see, I've removed the old welting material so I could sandblast and paint them, and I've got a new fuel tank strap welting kit from Ron Fitzpatrick Jeep Parts, and it comes with great instructions. Now we're using a Willys MB, so we're going to use a staple style. The Ford uses the rivets, and first thing I'm going to do is cut them to fit. They come with a roll that will get you enough material to do all 4 pieces. And then I really started struggling, trying to figure out what the best method was for getting the staples back in this fuel tank strap. The staples would prove to be very difficult to get in the old staple holes, not to mention pushing it through the asphalt webbing and then bending them over properly so that they fit and look right. So here's the procedure I ultimately settled on for doing the rest of them. I would get the staple started in the hole, and then on this towel I could pound it through, and that staple would go all the way through down through the towel. And then I found myself a little tiny socket. I think it's a 5mm socket, but something really small like that. And I'm going to use the channel locks to press the staple through the asphalt and into the socket. And that'll get that staple seated up against that fuel tank strap really tight. And once I've got that started, I flip it back over and take a hammer and just really seat it nice and tight. Make sure that staple is fitting really good. And then I kind of started just hammering over the staple ends. And I don't show it here, but I did end up going back with a chisel and kind of giving the staple ends one last little hammer to get the ends of the staples to kind of curl over. And that right there is the best I could come up with. Just repeat for the other 4 straps. So the first step is going to be to put these little short side of the fuel tank straps down, and they kind of fit down in between the side of the body and the tank, and can be a little bit difficult to slide in there where they're supposed to go, especially because the tank wasn't fitting right in the body in the first place. I wasn't getting the right amount of clearance. But I ended up getting it in there with a flashlight and a screwdriver. And now bring in the big straps, and they just hook in there and lay down. And now I'm going to realize that there's a really big gap in there, and the bolts are not long enough to draw that together. So I tried a couple different things. My first idea was to use that carpenter's clamp. My next idea was to use a longer bolt to draw it together until the shorter bolt would fit. And I ended up having to use a pair of these old pliers to kind of hold it while I released the bolt, and I can't believe that actually worked. And now the short bolt will fit, and this is the factory correct bolt. This is the one that came off of the Jeep. And get that in there, and now I can release the pliers. I could not get that to work on the front side, so I ended up having to brute force that one, and then the whole thing ended up having to come apart anyway, so I could remove some of that weather stripping. I tried removing some of the felts to get it to fit better, but ultimately I got it in and tightened up both the bolts evenly, and now the tank's in. Well, it's in. Not really happy with the way those straps are sitting. I'm gonna take another look at the hardware, but I was fighting this one weather strip that we glued in, and this reproduction tank has just really been a piece of junk. I'm pretty sure it's an Omix-Ada tank. The fuel sender didn't want to fit right. It just didn't fit quite right in the fuel tank well. And if I stick my finger in the water drain slots, I can still feel space underneath the tank. So I don't know why. Yeah, it's actually bending. It's completely sitting on the flap right there. It hasn't even touched the donut there. So I'm not really sure why it's not fitting right, but from what I hear, the aftermarket tanks really don't fit great anyways, so you're kind of just stuck with what is out there. But now that the fuel tank's in, I can go ahead and hook up that fuel line running up to the fuel pump, so get on with this. I ordered this fuel line from Ron Fitzpatrick Jeep Parts. It is for a late 45 Willys MB, and the difference with that is that the late ones didn't have the fuel strainer on the firewall. So this is a really simple fuel line that goes from the fuel tank straight to the fuel pump. First thing to do is straighten it out of the bag. They fold it in half so that it fits in a smaller box and it can be easily shipped to you. And just take your time and get it nice and straight. It actually bends really easy in your hands. Now, I could leave these little bend here stickers, but that really bugs me, and I wanted to get them off of the fuel line. But they're a paper sticker, so if you try to remove them, they just tear. So my little trick for getting those off is to soak them in brake clean, and that actually softens the adhesive, and they'll usually just peel right off. And now we have a nice clean look for our fuel line. This line slides in pretty easily. You kind of have to wiggle it above the clutch rod, and it actually weaves inside the gusset there on the body. I just took my time and got it in there right, made sure it was routed correctly. I had a little bit of tape in there plugging up the hole from when we were painting the tank, so I kind of fished that out. And now putting this line in, I had to do a lot of wiggling and jiggling to get it lined up right so that the threads would start. And I wanted to be real careful to make sure I didn't cross thread that tank since it's all strapped down in the body now. And the line still needed a little bit of tweaking, so I kind of had to bend it a couple times to get the angle right so that that fuel line would be going straight into the tank, and I could get that flare to seat nice and square. And I finally got it, so I tightened it down, and I messed up and didn't use a backup wrench on that tank. Make sure you use a backup wrench so you don't damage the tank. And here we have just one little flexible hose that goes from the fuel pump over to the hard line. And now we just need to put in the straps to secure this. One strap goes to this gusset, and I kind of use pliers a couple different ways to get these clamps to close down nice and square and make sure that the holes are all lined up. And it gets a regular head screw with a star washer and a nut, and that was included in the fuel line strap kit. On the bottom of the Jeep, I needed to drill a hole into this hat channel. It had been replaced when we were doing body work. And we're going to have another clamp that is going to self-tap and screw into that hat channel. There's one final screw that goes in the fender, but we'll have to put that on later. Here I needed to change out the fitting on the outlet portion of the pump with a female flare fitting. And then the fuel pump to carburetor fuel line goes in. This one also needed a little bit of tweaking to get the angles right, as it's a hard line, no flexible sections. So that's it for the fuel system, and we're going to be moving on to other projects. I need to get the steering gear assembly installed. The brake system needs to be plumbed. I've got the wiring harness here, and it's all ready to start getting wired up. We're going to be converting this thing from a 6-volt generator to a 12-volt alternator. I'm really excited for that project. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe so you can follow along with all these projects, and we'll see you in the next one.